As the gaming industry ages and more somewhat recent games get remade, the line between a game that is and isn't worth remaking gets blurrier, primarily since many of the titles being remade now were originally released well after the big technological jump in the early 2000s, and a vast majority of modern gaming's mechanics and design philosophies can be directly traced back to the games that are being remade, which sort of leads to controversy, if that's the word that we want to use. I've spoke about this in a previous video, but to reiterate, remakes can and should be allowed to alter a game's design in order to fit into whatever the new creative vision is, just as long as it maintains the same vibe, without it being characterized as a slight towards fans. Anyway. So what's the deal with that Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, am I right? I fucking hate that title, man. Dead Rising was originally an Xbox 360 exclusive, releasing within the first year of the console's lifespan, and for the lack of a better phrase, it was a big fucking deal. It took Capcom's love for zombies and campy gameplay and just sort of crammed it into the premise of Dawn of the Dead, and what they ended up with was not only a defining exclusive for that console and that entire generation, but a game that I legitimately believed helped change the culture of the industry, especially as the entire medium pushed farther towards more serious games with realism at the forefront as the 7th generation went on. Dead Rising and its follow-ups felt so much more important than just another zombie game, even when that genre became pretty bloated by the 2010s. Except, and I mean this with love, as much as I adore the original Dead Rising, I don't love playing it. It is a game that is saved by its charms and aesthetics, rather than one that's elevated by its gameplay. There's lots of minor annoyances that just bog down the experience, like the survivor AI being completely borked, the prisoner boss fight constantly respawning for some reason, also guns just straight up control like Resident Evil 4 down to holding the trigger and pressing X. Even though that this isn't a survival horror game, at least in the traditional sense, and it all just sort of takes away from the experience. And previous re-releases have altered things in minute ways, some for better or worse, like the HD remaster allowing the game to now run at 60 FPS, despite also having some frame rate problems, as well as just breaking certain weapons and boss fights entirely, or the Wii exclusive Chop Till You Drop remake leaning entirely on that Resident Evil 4 inspiration, but that's its own can of worms. The Deluxe Remaster offers Capcom a second chance to remake Dead Rising, all the while altering and updating certain parts of the original that were pretty bothersome. Some of them were overcorrections, but we'll get into that much later. I'd like to say that even though I'm going to be talking about Deluxe Remaster as its own game, since that's what I played for this video, pretty much all of my compliments and criticism apply to the original game as well. That is, save for the stuff that's different, which seems like a pretty smart place to begin. Without a doubt, the biggest difference between the original game and Deluxe is their respective art styles. I will always maintain that the original game's simplified graphics have stood the test of time due to how cartoonish they are. However, I did grow up playing games that look like this, so maybe it's just Stockholm Syndrome. The new game clearly goes for a more photorealistic style while still attempting to maintain the original designs, and the end product is entirely up to personal taste. Jesse looks the same, Brad looks off, Isabella is a major upgrade, but I will say that I did not like Frank's face at first. However, I got used to it about halfway through. He honestly looks closer to this beta trailer than he does to the original game's key art, but maybe that was the intention, I don't know. However, this emphasis on photorealism goes beyond just the models and is perpetuated into other parts of the graphic design. I think my personal gripe with remakes is that most just end up scrubbing away the original's individual identity, be it an attempt to be more visually in line with modern installments or just an attempt to simplify everything. It still sucks. Take Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, a great reimagining of the original games, except all of the original music and menus are gone. The same goes for Resident Evil 2 and 3, who have much more ambient soundtracks that tend to fade into the background, as opposed to the original game's more present and atmospheric soundscape. Thankfully, Resident Evil 4's menus have always sucked balls, but the thing is that the original Dead Rising's identity has always been cool as shit. The soundtrack alone is iconic. Every YouTuber has used this song at least once, including myself. If I'm walking alone in a park at night and this shit starts playing, I'm pissing on command. The news anchor-esque menus and colorful UI of the original, meant to tie into Frank's profession as a reporter, are changed in lieu of this minimalist Resident Evil-esque replacement. which sort of cuts out that whole part of the vibe, and it does make me a bit sad. In the original, when a survivor died, the game plastered their name in big red letters. Only in the remake, there's just a small warning at the top of the screen, like a notification. That made you look. In the original, this was done to impart the gravity to the player that you could have prevented this, enticing you to try again in a second playthrough. Granted, it's not a massive change, and it's frankly not something that most people will realistically notice or even care about, especially those who are playing the game for the very first time, and that sort of goes for most of the changes. There's some that I just really don't like. Is it weird and revisionist that the erotica photo category was removed entirely, and the psychopath Cliff is no longer a Vietnam vet and is now fucking pest control? Yes, I think these are dumb, massive overcorrections. But if this one line or one feature bothers you that much, I want to hold your hand as I say this, but this is a YouTube video. The original is still playable on all of the same platforms, and for much cheaper. What I'm trying to convey is that basically all the alterations to the Deluxe Remaster are present and mostly up to personal taste. None of these really detract from the original experience, which is overall kept intact, except I kinda wish that it wasn't. My biggest gripe with Deluxe Remaster is that it missed out on doing something massive by changing the way that we explore the mall. The Williamette Mall is an iconic locale in gaming at this point, and I do like some of the visual updates that were done. The added decor and general upgrade in textures makes this place feel brand new again. In the original game, when it was night, Frank had this weird halo all around him, always preventing the player from having any difficulty seeing what they're doing while the sun is down. Except in the remake, the night is portrayed as much more terrifying than the original. The darkness is so all-encompassing that you can only see silhouettes of zombies and cult members in places that are devoid of light, which just makes stuff like the lack of any background music all the more prevalent, amplifying the horror. It's one of my favorite additions to the environment, and it's such a small change. Because for the most part, the mall is still the same segmented areas stitched together with loading screen doors. So even though the map looks like this, it's really just a bunch of hallways that are sort of connected. What this means is that if you set something down and leave that area only to return, that item is no longer going to be where you originally set it. Food, magazines that offer power-ups, vehicles, and weapons, if they're not in your inventory, they'll all eventually disappear and return to their respective spawn points. Mostly because in 2006, I'm sure that implementing this as a mechanic would have been a headache, and remembering where an item spawns makes for subsequent playthroughs all the more fun, and rewards the player for noticing things like that. But the remake released in 2024, and while I'm sure that this would still very much be a headache for devs, having this mechanic where some items stay where you originally left them could have added to the survival element of the game, and maybe even counteracted the claims that the game is too easy, which I'll get into later. Had the mall been more integrated into one massive area, it could have allowed Dead Rising to be much more of a Metroidvania of sorts. I get it, man, it's an arcadey game, it's not really a big complaint. I think it's mostly the vehicles that bother me, especially when I go to the parking lot, ride a bike, only to drive it to a convenient area, I do a task, I come back, and it's completely fucking gone. It just pisses me off. Also, the jeep full of prisoners still respawns in the game, which is ridiculous. This game was made from the ground up in Unreal. Why is this still even an issue? That's not to say that the overall game experience is lacking. Au contraire. Mona Mare. This remake is the equivalent of adding whipped cream and a cherry on top of an already great milkshake, which is more than likely why, despite being a remake, almost nothing overly game-changing was implemented. Yes, Deluxe Remaster's difficulty has been characterized as simply making it easier, which the devs have gone on record saying was one of their goals for this game, and while yes, there are some things that have been made far too undemanding of the player, such as the excessive amount of points that you get for photography, allowing you to level up really fast. To say that it's a blanket too easy is a bit of an oversimplification. Like, yeah, the zombies are less aggressive when transporting survivors, but that's a complete upgrade that we all wanted. Zombies travel in much larger groups and are much more aggressive when completely solo. Plus, police zombies with handguns will just fire them off randomly. It's not an upgrade, it's just sort of funny. Speaking of which, the control scheme for firearms has been changed to be less like Resident Evil 4 and much closer to more modern shooters, where Frank can finally move and aim at the same time while still attempting to maintain some restrictions on the player. Like when you fire the gun, Frank stops in place. Make no mistake, you can still get fucked up pretty bad if you're not paying attention, especially at the very beginning and late stage points in the game. What matters the most is that the core of Dead Rising is still intact, which is the meld of exploration, saving survivors, and fighting bosses, or psychopaths as they're called here. Each of these 3 parts in this setting makes for a game that legitimately engrossed me for an entire 48 hours. I began playing this game the day that I bought it, and even when I took breaks to sleep and shower, I was still mentally in that fucking mall. I love the amount of detail that's put into this world. Like when you go to fight the psychopath Joe, a crazy police officer who is holding a bunch of women hostage, since all of the missions are time sensitive, depending on when you fight her, she'll have anywhere from 5 hostages to only 1. Initially, I thought the number was randomized to make transporting them harder or easier as like a dynamic difficulty thing, but what the game does not tell you is that Joe is slowly killing each of her prisoners off one by one as the timer goes down. That is fucking awesome. I mean, you know what I mean. It rewards players who pay attention, it adds a bit more horror to the game, and it makes for a tangible reason to replay the game to see if you can save all of the survivors. It fucking rules, man. There's lots of little things like that can be discovered in the mall, but hands down, my favorite part of Dead Rising is when different parts of the game accidentally overlap. Dead Rising is a game all about improvisation, from the story about a reporter who's thrown into a zombie-infested mall and has to work alongside the fucking feds in order to stop it, to the gameplay of beating up zombies with a bench. So it makes sense for the overall gameplay loop to emphasize that as well. In any other game, 2 quests overlapping will, at best, be annoying, and at worst, just break the scripting entirely. But in Dead Rising, it somehow only makes the game more interesting. Like on the 3rd night, cultists and zombies were attacking me as I went to enter the gun shop, only for me to run into the 3 survivors that are stationed there. Now, usually with this subplot, if you want to save them, you're supposed to leave that room, which will initiate this whole quest allowing you to escort them to the security room and whatever. By this point in the game, it's something that you've at least attempted about 20 times or so. But man, I got cultists running through the door, stabbing me and shit, zombies grabbing me, and now I got 3 fuckheads in front of me shooting me, so I just started blasting. Needless to say, those survivors ended up dying, and I felt really bad, at least as much as you can for lines of code. But I was simultaneously so in love with how much those different parts of the game came together to make something completely new and unique to my playthrough. Sure, I very well could have reloaded the save, looked at a guide on how to complete that side quest, taken out the cultists first, save all 3 survivors, and just skip our way to the security room so I could have some sort of perfect run. But that's sort of missing the point of the game. A very similar thing happened earlier in the game when I was transporting a survivor, only to accidentally run into the father-son psychopath trio who all tried to snipe Frank at the same time. Which you think would be annoying. I'm literally doing an escort mission with 3 snipers shooting at me all at the same time, and yet somehow it only added to the tension and made it more fun. If you've never played the game for yourself and are somehow still watching this video, and you don't believe that all these pieces come together to make a personal jigsaw puzzle that's so much fun, just watch anybody play this fucking game and you will immediately understand what I'm saying. Not to mention that the survivor AI has been severely updated, so saving them is all the more easier, which just makes me feel more guilty when some of them inevitably die. Good job, Capcom. Throughout the game, you naturally get so familiar with this environment that little changes begin to set you off. Like the food court ominously being empty on the 2nd night because there's a cult meeting being held there. Or the reveal in the final act of the game that you've passed by Carlito's hideout countless times, more than likely writing off that area as an abandoned storage room, sort of making you question all the other shit that you've ended up missing. But without a doubt, no moment hits harder than the silence in the final moments of 72-hour mode or the main story before Frank's helicopter comes to save him. Once the military arrives on the final night and executes all the zombies, there's nothing left. No survivors, no zombies, not even any soldiers left to patrol. Simply the sounds of the mall, the squeaking of the rides in Wonderland Plaza, the music for each respective wing, the intercom voice. And it's all really unsettling. Partly because of the imagery of piles of bodies, but it's also about how everything has been flipped on its head. Initially, as you're getting into Dead Rising, the sounds of the mall work to make the player more comfortable and provide an almost comedic level of dissonance. Killing zombies with a shopping cart while listening to mall jazz is the exact sort of vibe that Dead Rising goes for. It's sort of the series' MO. If you remove the mall music, then all you hear is the zombies' groans like at night, making the game feel more daunting than it actually is. So, during the day, the two sort of work in tandem to create the unique vibe of Willamette Mall, which you begin to get comfortable with over the course of the 10-ish hour playthrough. But once all the zombies inside are dead and there's nothing but the music over the speakers and the sound of Frank's feet, it makes for a pretty uncomfortable ambiance. The finality of everything begins to settle in. Granted, all of this build-up is sort of ruined by overtime mode if you're going for the true ending, but thankfully, even there, Dead Rising still does something interesting with its mechanics. Dead Rising is a shit ton of alternate endings, many of them are a variation of you either escape or you die, but there's only one true ending. To get there, you have to get ending A, where Frank arrives to the helipad only for his pilot to fucking die randomly, because of course he does. And Frank collapses in shock and is bitten by a zombie. But Isabella wants to help cure him, sending Frank on a pretty fucking shitty fetch quest around the whole mall. I did not like overtime mode, man. But it's revealed that Isabella only manages to stay safe from the zombies thanks to a zombie repellent that she's concocted. And the only way to get out of Willamette Mall is to go through a cave that's just crammed full of zombies. And they'll have to do it together. Where Frank at the beginning of the game was this selfish reporter who only changed over the course of the game by saving survivors, Isabella seems like a villain since she's, the main villain's little sister, but she ends up revealing her truly good nature by saving Frank. Where the majority of the game, we're guiding the survivors to safety, Isabella guides us. Man, that's fucking genius. It doesn't matter if this was intentional by the team at Capcom, okay? What matters is that it makes the overall experience all the more compelling. Both the predetermined narrative and the moment-to-moment storytelling done through gameplay makes Dead Rising one of the most interesting zombie stories told in gaming. And this final moment in the cave just cements that. One problem though, and that's that the actual ending fucking sucks. Don't get me wrong, I like the haunting nature of the final lines, implying that all of Frank's work has just gone into the gutter. The idea that we never get the feeling of satisfaction, even in the good ending, is smart, and it feels like a gut punch. The end credits song is amazing. Everything else blows. Like I said, I'm not a fan of overtime mode. It's so pointless, and I blatantly cannot imagine playing this mode in the original game. The concept of the military coming to clean house is a nice way to up the stakes in the final act. But actually fighting these spongy-ass Special Forces soldiers is a fucking nightmare. And I only succeeded because I hoarded as many of their guns as I could in the final parts of the main game, solely out of pettiness since they took my fucking clothes 2 times, man. Story-wise, Dead Rising is not a relatively deep game. Carlito reveals that he started the outbreak as revenge for the United States creating the virus in his country as a way to genetically make more meat. And I gotta say, kind of a fucking sick reason for a horror game, man. But the last minute reveal of some random ass, bald motherfucking military general as the real bad guy felt like a waste of my time. Especially since the actual final fight sucks donkey dick. The turret section was fun, but the hand-to-hand fight was the worst. Mostly because all of Frank's melee moves are a variation of spamming square and jumping. I promise you, just spam X and square interchangeably and you'll win in a minute flat. It's just so baffling that a game with so many great boss fights, many of which are optional that you can completely miss on multiple playthroughs, ends with this as its final send-off. Not to mention that Frank yelling into the heavens as he and Isabella tries to fight off more zombies. That's how the game ends. Now I know what it felt like to watch the fucking Sopranos in 2008. And hyperbolic anger aside, I love this game, lackluster ending and all, and despite getting the true ending, I still haven't experienced everything in this game, not even close. Somehow, this remake manages to toe the line by maintaining that original experience while offering it to an entirely new generation, which is sort of why re-releases and remakes matter so much. And while I could look at the overly negative fan reception as any of these things, it's better to think of this game as so influential and significant that it's led to a fan base that's so engrossed in all of the small details. Sorta sweet when you look at it that way. It's not nearly as interesting as the Resident Evil remakes, which are in almost entirely separate games, but there's still some merit in giving a game a facelift for a new age. Maybe Dead Rising 2 will get its own remake. The way Capcom's been going, it probably will, but I sort of wish that the publisher will take this revived fan interest and put that focus towards a smaller scaled 5th entry instead. Considering that installment had a ton of interesting ideas that never got to come to fruition, and plus Dead Rising 2's been remade already. But that's a story for another day. A day that will come in the far future. I don't know, man, I got a lot of videos to make.
この町の必需品ガムテープねぐるぐるでくっつけてこれならどんどん倒せちゃう君次第で組み合わせはたくさん広がるよ Enjoy Zombie Dead Rising 2 カプコン